The Fallout universe has long been one of my favourite science fiction settings, with my love of the franchise starting with Fallout 3 over a decade ago. I've spent countless hours traversing the Capitol Wasteland, delving into the lore and soaking up the amazing imagery and setting of the game. It feels almost familiar and yet totally alien, and I think that's why I love this universe so much. I've long wanted to create my own vision of Fallout in miniature, and over the last several weeks I've been building a scene that tells one of the many tales of the Lone Wanderer's journey through the Capitol Wasteland, and in this video I'm going to share it with you. I'm Benji and welcome to Benji's Hobbies. So this build starts with the main component of the board I'm building, the ruined overpass. This could represent one of the many locations in what used to be DC, so I want to make sure it looks generic enough that it could be anywhere in the Capitol Wasteland. I'm using this laser cut MDF kit from TT Combat, which I took off the sprue, cleaned up and stuck together with super glue. Once the bridge section was built, I placed it roughly where I wanted it to be on my cutting mat, and marked out a rough area with some masking tape to help me plan out the dimensions of the board and give me an idea of the space I had to play with. Once I settled on a size and rough layout, I cut a sheet of MDF to size and stuck a thin layer of XPS foam to create a baseboard before piling up some thick polystyrene sheets to add some height at the back and to have a solid structure for the overpass to be coming off. I tidied up the polystyrene blocks with my hot wire cutter and attached them together with Gorilla Glue to give a solid bond. Whilst I waited for the glue to dry, I cut a thin sheet of XPS which would cover the front of the cheap polystyrene, and began carving in some concrete blocks and adding some cracks and textured areas. I coated this in Mod Podge and undercoated it with a grey primer. To make this look like a more convincing concrete, I'm using some grey tiling grout. I find that it's easier to use materials in the colour that you want rather than having to paint things afterwards, so whilst I could have textured this with sand and then painted it, it felt like I was saving myself some extra work. I diluted down a little PVA with water and painted this all over the front of the primed foam, and then sprinkled on some grout by hand, which was then left to dry completely. Once it was dry, I used a soft brush to dust away any loose grout, to leave me with a nice concrete-like texture. With the front fascia completed, I glued it in place with Gorilla Glue and used some small clamps to hold it in place while it dried. Next, I wanted the bridge to match the concrete fascia, so I primed the bridge with a cheap rattle can in a light grey, before mixing up some thinned down PVA, but this time adding a small amount of flow improver to reduce the surface tension and help it spread over the smooth MDF coating. This time, rather than sprinkling the grout on by hand, I used a sieve to give a much smoother and neater coat, and to help me get the grout where I wanted it. Finally, I gave all the grouted areas a liberal spray with Geek Gaming Scenics sealant to lock it all in place and hopefully make the piece slightly more durable. Next, I wanted to create a smashed up road area with loads of crack damage and exposed rebar and reinforcing rods. I cut up a sheet of chicken wire to the size of a thin baking tray using some wire snippers, and with the wire held in place with some hot glue, I mixed up a batch of casting plaster and poured this over the top before smoothing it out and letting it set. This becomes solid very quickly, but doesn't set entirely hard for a few days, so it's still fairly easy to cut and shape with hand tools. I used my snips to cut the road sections into shape and glued them in place both on the board and on the overpass. Where I'd gone a bit overboard with adding damage, I added some loose pieces of plaster back on to represent crumbled road and concrete, and snipped away some of the wire to make it look more damaged after being exposed. Before progressing any further with the roads, I wanted to make sure that the rest of my ground areas was sorted. I glued down some pieces that I had 3D printed and also stuck down 2 short lengths of piping which will form the wells for my trash can fires, which I'll come on to a little bit later. I covered the entire ground area with modelling compound, avoiding getting any on the road, and added some gentle undulations to help add a bit of variety to the landscape and blend in any of the extra elements I'd already added. Once this was dry, I thinned down some brown craft paint and slapped it all over. Whilst this will be completely covered later on, it will help hide any areas where my ground cover might be a bit thin or patchy, and it'll help it blend in. I also painted the roads with a thinned down grey craft paint. Once the roads were dry, I returned to the grout technique and yet again watered down some PVA before sprinkling on the grout. Whilst I did brush away a lot of the excess, I left some piled up at the edges of the road and in gaps, as this would help blend in the road and make it look less stark. When I was happy with how much grout was left, I used a small pipette and applied thinned down PVA to any areas where there was a thick layer of grout to help lock it all in place. Next, I added the rest of the ground cover. For this, I use a 50-50 mix of Geek Gaming Forest Path Base Ready and brown grout. These two combined make a really nice ground cover and are perfect for the look I was going for. The Base Ready adds loads of texture, whilst the grout will help lock it all in place once it's dry. To add a bit of variation to the ground cover, I used some Geek Gaming Arid Earth Base Ready, and sprinkle this in patches across the board, which not only helps break it up, but is also perfect for blending in the different elements. Again, once I was happy with the Arid Earth patches, I both pipetted some watered down PVA over the top, and gave it a liberal coating with a spray bottle. With the main board mostly finished, it was time to start painting in some of the smaller details. I started by painting all the exposed rebar and any other details such as oil drums and the metal girder in a dark brown paint, followed by stippling on orange to represent rust and corrosion. Finally, I picked out the very edges with a tiny amount of gunmetal. Whilst I was happy with the textures on the road, I wanted to help make them pop a little, so I dry brushed on some patches of light grey to help add some definition to the edges and to the broken up sections of the road. I added some road markings along the side of the road using a stenciler made out of thin plastic card, and stippled on some white paint with an old brush, and I'm really pleased with how this ended up turning out. With the main board pretty much complete, I glued the overpass in place before moving on to creating all the small details and extra pieces that would really add some character to this board and help make it really recognisable as a scene from Fallout. I was conscious that underneath the overpass would always end up looking pretty dark, so I was really keen to add some LED lights to help illuminate it. I bought some flickering tea lights off eBay that I wanted to make into flaming trash cans. I cut some small discs of plastic card to create covers that would help hide the battery compartments before gluing on some small 3D printed canisters over the top. I primed them all in black and painted them much the same way as I'd painted a lot of the other rusted details on the board, starting with a dark brown, moving into an orange and then a light touch of silver on the edges. To help blend them into the board, I first glued on some of the ground cover mixed, followed by some arid earth. I wanted to add some damaged, rusty looking barrier walls to the board, which looked like they could have been cobbled together from wasteland scraps by raiders or super mutants. I clipped some sprues up into various lengths to create a rough frame, and cobbled together some different textured panels to add some variation. I cut squares from plain plastic card, 3D printed some thin checker plate sheeting, and also made my own corrugated sheets. I made these using a corrugation tool that I found on Thingiverse and placed some foil sheets between them and squeezing them together to create the texture. Whilst I don't think they would be the most hard wearing for gaming pieces, they look great for diorama purposes, and I think it's something that I'll definitely revisit in a future build. Once all the panels were glued on those sprue frames, I painted them a variety of metallic, wooden and rusty colours, and applied different brown and black washes to make them look old and damaged, and once they were dry I glued them in place. Whilst I was building and painting these fences, I had my 3D printer going at full speed to print off some cool accessories and bits to fill my board, including some iconic Corvega cars, a new Coca-Cola machine, some vault crates, a red rocket sign, and a tiny little surprise. If you notice it later on in the video, then go and let me know where you spotted it in the comments down below, and let me know which characteristics or stat you'd like to level up. Because a lot of these items were damaged and rusty looking, I used this as an opportunity to try out some new weathering tools that I've never used before, such as streaking grime, rust deposits, and chipping medium. After playing about with some of these, I am seriously impressed with how easy it was to get results, and can't wait to work on some future projects where I can utilise these little gems. Last, but by no means least, I painted up my characters for this build. A bunch of gnarly looking raiders, and of course the Lone Wanderer. I painted up the Wanderer in the iconic blue jumpsuit with yellow trim, and painted the raiders up in some darker tones, but chose to give them some bright and colourful hairstyles. I'm not sure where they're finding all this hair dye post-apocalypse, but wherever they're getting it from, they seem to have a solid supply. These really are some awesome miniatures from Modiphius, and I'm excited to get my hands on some more, especially perhaps some NCR or Caesar's Legion from New Vegas. If you want to get some yourselves, I popped a link down in the description below. I glued all of the extra elements and my characters in place, added some extra weathering powders to help add some contrast in some areas and give a dusty finish, and with that, my board is done.
Air feels all fucked up tonight. I think a storm's coming. Shut the fuck up a second. I hear something. Did you hear that? Someone there? Huh? Hearing shit. Hearing those damn noises again. Hey! I think someone's out there. If there is, they're dead meat. Over there! Watch it! Come on, boys! Fresh meat!
It's go time! Tear them apart!